The next generation of family history is here. Storied is taking family history to new and exciting places with AI, storied books, and more. With billions of historical records and exclusive newspaper publications, you can build and expand your family tree with ease. Collaborating with your family has never been easier or more affordable. Don't let your family's legacy go untold. Preserve these memories in a beautiful, interactive format that will be cherished for generations. Turn your family's journey into a stunning storied book, a keepsake to pass down to your children and grandchildren. Visit Storied today and get started for free. That's Storied, STORIED.com.
Welcome to the Family Tree Magazine podcast. It's the podcast from America's #1 genealogy magazine. I'm Andrew Cook, editor of Family Tree Magazine, filling in for Lisa Louise Cook. Now that it's March, our thoughts turn to St. Patrick's Day and Irish ancestry. In this episode, we're talking about how to overcome common brick walls in Irish genealogy research. I'll be interviewing author and genealogist Eliza Watson, who's written an article on that subject for the latest issue of Family Tree Magazine. Even if you don't have ancestors from the Emerald Isle, I hope you'll find our conversation about brick wall busting techniques like reverse genealogy and investigating off-the-beaten-path records to be helpful. We'll also hear from Kendall Hewlett, CEO of our sponsor Storied. He'll talk about what sets Storied apart from other family tree builders and the special offer they have for RootsTech 2024. As always, we have a lot to get to. Let's dive in. I am here with Eliza Watson. She is a USA Today best-selling author and genealogist. Her book is Genealogy Tips and Quips, and she has an article in the upcoming March-April 2024 issue of Family Tree Magazine called May the Road Rise to Meet You. Eliza, welcome to the Family Tree Magazine podcast.
Thanks, Andrew. It is wonderful to be here. I'm excited to be able to provide a few tips about breaking down your Irish brick walls.
You know, when you approached us with this article idea, I thought, what a great way of talking about Irish research, because Ireland has such a reputation for being a particularly difficult place to research your ancestors. So is that reputation warranted? And if so, why?
Yeah, so I would say a person needs to have a wee bit more perseverance and creativity when researching Ireland versus countries like Scotland and England, where historical record collections are more complete and go way back. Sadly, many of Ireland's records were destroyed by fires or government orders throughout the years. The most devastating loss occurred in 1922 in an explosion at the Public Records Office in Dublin during the Irish Civil War. This included all existing pre-1901 censuses except for a few fragments. But rather than mourning the loss of those records, I always tell people a researcher needs to focus on what survived. The 1901 census could include people born back in the early 1800s. Civil registration records survive, and they began in 1864, recording births, marriages, and deaths, and church records, many of which date back from the early 1800s. Now, half of the Church of Ireland, which are the Protestant records, were lost in that 1922 explosion, unfortunately. However, all Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist records weren't housed at the Public Records Office. One thing to remember is baptismal and marriage records don't merely provide parents' and children's names, but usually the sponsors and witnesses were likely family members. So that can help piece together the family tree. Availability of church records really varies widely, depending not only on the county, but the parishes within it. Like County Wicklow, one parish may have records beginning in 1868, then others like Wicklow Parish date back to 1747. If your ancestors were from Waterford, you are really in luck. Many of the parishes in that county have records back to the early to mid-1700s, even a few 1600s for the Church of Ireland records. And Wexford Parish in Wexford County dates back to 1686. Now, you need to keep in mind any parish records may have gaps in them. The records, for example, in my Coffey Ancestors Parish in Westmeath began in 1806, yet I managed to trace the line back to 1705 thanks to church records, gravestones, and several kind Irish locals, including a newfound daily relic. So I think it's important when you start your research to know what records are available in the county you're researching. Family Search has a wiki page for each county, and genealogist John Grenham's website is an incredible source for this.
I really like what you said about you have to know what records are available and not focus on what's lost, but focused on, what's available. And because it's not so doom and gloom, yes. And that there are still things to learn about your ancestor in their particular time and place if you know where to look.
Yes, you just need to, focus on the availability in your specific county and get creative. I've done some creative things.
Sure, yeah. And so you mentioned record loss and you mentioned gaps in records. What are some other common brick walls that people face when looking for their Irish ancestors?
I would say common first and last names can easily cause brick walls. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about using the family naming pattern to help solve research challenges. Common place names definitely can pose a problem. I was once researching Balrath, County Westmeath, and I went back to continue my research and realized I was in Balrath, Meath. It turned out there are 9 Balraths, and they're all located in counties Meath and Westmeath. Now, that's not as many as somewhere like Knockrow, which doesn't sound like a common name, but there are 64 Knockrows in Ireland. Oh, wow. So when you think about it, family folklore might say or claim that an ancestor is from Knockrow. And somewhere along the way, a person looks up Knockrow and finds the first one located in County Cavan and thinks, that's it, I found Knockrow. However, the ancestor actually came from Knockrow in Cork. So if you hit a brick wall, look for other locations with the same place names that you're researching. Again, John Grenham's site is excellent for this. He will tell you the different locations for each one of the place names, what counties they might be in. And I also just want to mention, too, that when you encounter a brick wall, it's so important to ask yourself, did I build this brick wall? I think new researchers especially often make the mistake of not doing enough research in the U.S., Australia, or whatever country their ancestors immigrated to before anxiously searching the 32 counties in Ireland for a Patrick Kelly. So find every bit of information on your immigrant ancestor in his new country before researching his homeland. Also, keep in mind when you're looking at a record that there's often a thread of truth, even in what appears to be wrong information. For example, I have my Watson ancestors, U.S. death certificate, and the death certificate for 2 of his siblings, and they all had different mothers' names. I had their Montreal baptismal record, so I knew Bridget Connolly was the mother of all 3. One death record had the mother's name as Delia Greaves. I put this record aside thinking it didn't have any useful information. Later, I learned that Delia is a nickname for Bridget. Seriously, never would have thought of that. So that's also a tip to make sure you know the possible nicknames for the names you're researching. So I took a better look at the surname and decided it was likely Guire and not Greaves. It was very poorly written. And then I recalled in an 1842 Montreal census, my ancestors lived next door to a Maguire family. So it's quite possible that Bridget's mother's maiden name was Guire, not Bridget. Bridget was a Connolly. So, and that's happened to me more than once, that somebody has heard a surname, that somewhere in history the surname exists, and they give it to the wrong person, and they remember it as being their grandmothers or being their mothers, and actually it was their grandmothers. And, especially like Bridget Connolly, she died when the kids were in their early teens. So, they may not have remembered it themselves either, or have known her maiden name. My last suggestion for breaking down a brick wall is don't take no for an answer. Even experts make mistakes and may overlook a faded document with hard-to-read handwriting or grossly misspelled surnames. So if a genealogist or experienced volunteer comes up empty, consider double-checking his work. Several times my gut told me that record has to exist, and it did. So just, again, don't take no for an answer. Keep looking. At least double-check.
I think what you said is very true, especially that sometimes people build their own brick wall, and it's sort of a lack of diligence sometimes, or a lack of creativity, like you said earlier, where, and that's something we've advocated before too. Make sure that this is an actual brick wall, that you're really missing a record or documentation and not just that something was lost in family lore, that you haven't fully explored a certain kind of resource. Definitely.
Yep.
So you mentioned, and you talk in the article about Irish naming patterns. Can you talk a little bit about what those are and how they can be helpful, especially with common names?
Yes, this has been very helpful in my research. Many families adhered to the traditional Irish naming pattern. Names had personal meanings and weren't randomly selected, as they often are today. So the firstborn son was named after the father's father, the second after the mother's father, the third after the father himself, the fourth after the father's oldest brother, and so on down his line of brothers. Daughters were named in this same pattern after the mother's side of the family. Now, it wasn't an exact science, and not everybody followed it. Like if a husband and wife, both their fathers were named Patrick, they're not going to name two kids in a row Patrick. So the second child, you go on to the third child, or the third name in the naming pattern. I first learned about the importance of the naming pattern when I came across 3 Catherines born to the same couple. The first 2 had died, and then they reused that name, and the third child, the third Catherine, lived into adulthood. So the names were so important that they reused them. So this was something that I was not really familiar with. So this was absolutely a good thing to learn and help me a lot. The naming pattern definitely can help you trace those hard to find women with married surnames. My ancestor, Eliza Butler McDonald, immigrated from County Wicklow to southwest Wisconsin. In the 1870 census, Eliza was married and had daughters Ellen, Mary Elizabeth, and Catherine in that order. Eliza had named her firstborn daughter after her mother Eleanor, who died in Ireland. Eliza's neighbor was Mary Kavanagh, and her firstborn daughter was Ellen, possibly Eliza's sister. I searched for other women in the area with daughters Ellen, Mary, Eliza, and Catherine. And I discovered a Catherine living a few towns away with 4 girls following the Butler family naming pattern. A bit of research and I confirmed Mary and Catherine were indeed Eliza's sisters. Also, I just want to mention this too, is that it can be important as to what names aren't in your family naming pattern. Like people will so often get overwhelmed and say, oh, my whole tree is full of Patricks, Michaels, and Johns, and I get it, mine are too. But what about the absence of names Hugh, Owen, and Peter? When I was researching my Flannerys from Castlebar, County Mayo, they had immigrated to southern Wisconsin. Flannery is an uncommon name. In Ireland, it pretty much exists in like 4 to 5 very western counties of Ireland, including Mayo. And it just so happened in southern Wisconsin, there was one other family that lived about 20 miles from my family. And my family, first names common were James, John, and Thomas. Well, this family, it was Hugh, Owen, and Peter were a few of the common names, which don't find in my family tree. And so it turned out they weren't related. So it can help you weed out, just the same as finding people that share, names in common with your family tree. Weeding out uncommon names. Now, you will have sometimes the maternal name enter the tree, like the wife's father may be a name that isn't common, in your tree. But you can pretty much tell if you're not going back generations with all of these same names. And I mean, none of them matched my Flannerys. It can be a good source to also weed out names that don't fit in your naming pattern. Middle names. Traditionally, the Irish didn't give their children middle names. My immigrant ancestors started using middle names to memorialize loved ones left behind in Ireland. It turned out that the children's middle names, like Lawrence, Richard, and Christopher, were my ancestors' uncles in Ireland. So there I just expanded the family tree even more with names that, were not common that I knew in the family line. A great place to learn middle names in the U.S. would be the World War I and II draft cards.
Yeah, definitely. And in the article, you mentioned that birth order becomes really important in learning in what order were these siblings born, because that will help you match up. Okay, well, if you're looking at a second son, then maybe you search for his grandfather, a maternal grandfather of the same name, just
Correct.
Following the naming pattern. So earlier you mentioned the 1901 and the 1911 censuses of Ireland survive in full, but that earlier counts are not available. what can researchers use as substitutes for those earlier censuses?
So one thing I just want to mention is don't forget about the surviving census fragments like I did. Until a few years ago, I'd never researched a location in Ireland where the pre-1901 censuses were available. Then I was assisting a gentleman with research in County Antrim. Well, it turns out the largest collection of surviving 1851 census fragments pertain to Antrim. So I didn't even think of it, turning to the census at first because it had never been available for research, where I was doing it. So the 1851 census, in addition to your general census information, it listed absent family members. So this is 1851, right after the famine. So it would list where their current place of residence was, which may be America or Australia, and also family members who died since the last census. So when I was going through this 1851 census, I have to say it was really hard to remind myself, don't mourn the lost records, but also don't forget about the fragments, because if you do have a fragments available for the area you're researching, definitely that would be your first source to look at. You may find early census information on pension forms. In 1908, Ireland introduced the Old Age Pension Act for people over the age of 70. So civil registration of births didn't begin until 1864. So many of those eligible for a pension had no way to prove their age when they were born before 1864. As a result, many people sent forms to the Public Record Office, which held the 1841 and 51 census records, containing proof that they were entitled to a pension. These forms contain information such as their parents' names, other family members, birthplace, residence, stuff like that. It's a small collection, but a very important one. Other census substitutes include like the Flax Report from 1796,
Tithe Allotment Books, 1823 to 1837.
Griffith's Valuation, 1847 to 64. However, these only mention the head of households. Ones that list other family members potentially would be the Ireland Petty Session Court Records, the National School List, Muster and Militia Rolls, and my favorite, gravestones. So gravestones, you may find the transcriptions online. I'm starting to find more on sites like Find a Grave and other Ireland-only sites, but also local libraries often have transcriptions done by a local historian or other people in the area, and then also a local historian. I mean, normally they probably have donated the transcriptions to the library, but it's also another source to consider. Again, availability varies widely by county as far as if they're available within these collections.
Yeah, it reminds me, we've covered the 1890 U.S. federal census pretty thoroughly, and it's a similar conversation where, most of it was lost, but there are some fragments, and there are other schedules that, were taken along with the main population schedule that survived. So you don't have to totally throw out, the whole count. There are workarounds, and I know a lot of people, as you pointed out, Griffith's Valuation and the Tithe Allotment books are sort of the most commonly recommended go-tos, but they do unfortunately only list the head of household. So, sometimes you have to think more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now a word from our sponsor. I'm here with Kendall Hewlett. He is the CEO of Storied. Welcome to the Family Tree Magazine podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here, Andrew. Thank you.
So, Kendall, can you tell me in your own words what sets Storied apart from other websites where you can build a family tree?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are interesting about Storied. One of them is that Storied uses graph technology, kind of like a social network. So you can actually add anyone to your family tree. Most trees are family oriented around parent and child relationships. But in our tree system, you can add anyone, like a friend, a pastor, a teacher, anyone who made an impact in your life, because we all define family differently. You can even add a pet. And so that's a fun aspect of Storied that makes it a little bit different. The other thing is we're really an end-to-end family history platform. And what I mean by that is you can come to Storied, you can start a family tree, you can make discoveries through hints and all of our content, newspapers, all the kinds of cool things that we have. But you can also do storytelling. on the platform. You can invite a group to share stories together. And ultimately, you can print that in a hardbound book, which is a really cool, like the other end of the end-to-end platform is that there's a physical, tangible output from all of the work that you've done that you can pass down to your children, your grandchildren. And the book actually is really neat because it has QR codes for each story, and you can scan those QR codes, and that will actually pull up the digital version of the story where you can get more details, and you could even listen to things like audio files that are associated with the story, maybe hear it told in the original writer's own words and all kinds of things like that. So it's a really rich platform from that perspective.
Yeah, and one thing that struck me was that you could add all the different sorts of relationships that maybe get missed in other platforms. I have 2 cats, so I was very excited that I could add my pets to my family tree and add stories.
They're your family, right? That's
absolutely.
Right? Yeah,
absolutely. And what inspired you to build Storied?
Yeah, so there was a New York Times article. It was a really seminal piece for me, and I think for a lot of the other people, the early people at Storied. It was written by a guy named Bruce Feiler, and it was about some research done at Emory University. And the gist of the research, if you had to boil it down, is that kids are more resilient if they know a lot about their family history. And, how do kids learn about their family history? It's not the names, dates, and places on some tree. It's the stories, right? And the reason that I think stories make kids more resilient is they see the ups and downs and the arc of life, right? Like it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, a rags to riches story, a riches to rags story. Mm-hmm. And it helps you realize that, you're part of a bigger thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so you don't have to get so whipsawed by some of the things that happen in life because there are ups and there are downs, and all throughout that, your family has persevered, right? And so anyway, I think for us, that was super inspirational, right? We have an opportunity to help people tell stories. It felt like there was a real gap in the family history marketplace because most of the products are really oriented around research, which is important. But I think the things that make the biggest difference are actually stories.
Yeah, and I think about that next generation aspect a lot. I have a young daughter, so, my research has taken on a new meaning because I want to pass this along to her someday too.
Yeah, for sure.
So as our listeners are hearing this right now, the Roots Tech conference is going on in Salt Lake City. So can you tell us a little bit about what Storied has going on this week for the conference?
Yeah. So first of all, we have a really awesome deal for Roots Tech. For just $99, you get access to Storied and Newspaper Archive, all of our newspapers, and one free Storied book, the hardbound book, as part of the deal for the conference. So just $99, you get all of that for a full year. So it's a pretty good deal. I mean, this is like the best deal. I don't know if I'll be able to authorize such a good deal next time, but man, this is a good one. And we're also rolling out a bunch of new features and functionality. So we'll be supporting audio and PDFs. We have a really cool import feature from Family Search. So if you have a family tree on Family Search, you can pull it in, and all of the memories that are on Family Search, you can pull in quickly and easily to jumpstart your story book, which is really fun. We're also supporting recipes. So family recipes is kind of a big deal and much talked about at Roots Tech. And we're excited that now you can produce your own family cookbook with stories about each recipe, photos, and everything compiled in a hardbound book. So anyway, lots of fun things that we're rolling out for Roots Tech that gives you a taste of a few of them.
Wonderful. And we'll share a link to all of that in the show notes so our listeners can take advantage of that offer while it lasts. Well, thank you so much, Kendall, and we'll see you in Salt Lake City.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. Take care.
You mentioned the Great Famine. Obviously, that's one of the seminal moments in Irish history, especially from sort of an Irish-American lens, and that drove a lot of people to emigrate from Ireland. What effect does the Great Famine have on research?
Yeah, during the Great Famine, which was 1845 to 51, approximately an estimated 1 million people died, and 2.5 immigrated, scattering across the globe to the US, Canada, Australia. But before ending up in one of those faraway lands, your ancestor might have done what's called steppe migration and merely sailed across the Irish Sea to England or Scotland. England's 1851 census recorded nearly 500,000 Irish-born people living there, double the number in the 1841 census. So also, besides England, look to Scotland. Petty session court records are a very good source because crime was on the rise during and after the famine. People turned to petty crimes, desperate to feed themselves and family. Some committed crimes to be imprisoned, so they had food and shelter. I mean, it was so sad. Or they entered the dreaded Irish workhouse, often called the famine house. Prior to the famine, workhouses were built in Ireland to help the poor. By 1845, the beginning of the famine, there were 123 workhouses. In 1847, a workhouse that was built for 800 was accommodating 1,800 destitute people. So they were fighting to get a spot in these unsanitary places that had brutal conditions that provided like 2 pathetic meals a day in exchange for hard labor. And worst of all, the parents were separated from their children. Right. So sadly, there's a good chance that you might find your ancestor in the workhouse in poor law records at some point during the famine.
Yeah, it was, obviously a tragic time. And I think it's always interesting and important to learn why your ancestors would have left their homeland. And the Great Famine, I think, is one of the clearest examples of that.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a very sad time, and you think about, the things that we complain about nowadays compared to, back then. I tell myself that when my flight's delayed 6 hours and I'm like, okay, it's going to take me 8 hours to get to Chicago when it took my immigrant ancestors 6 to 8 weeks on a coffin ship. I mean, it's it's amazing. They were definitely sturdy stock.
Oh, definitely. And I think I've heard that the population of Ireland hasn't fully recovered from the famine.
No, it hasn't.
Yeah.
It hasn't, and they're worried right now about still so many people immigrating to get jobs, young people getting out of, the high school or university and going to Australia or the US. I mean, it's so common to talk to people there who have children in Australia and the US or Canada.
Well, talking about moving across the Atlantic, obviously under very different circumstances, you advocate getting into your ancestors' community to do research. And I know for a lot of listeners and for myself, heritage travel is a bucket list item. So what tips do you have for traveling across the pond to Ireland?
I would say my number one trip is, if at all possible, to find your family homestead in advance. So that would be one of your top items to hopefully visit. Griffith's Valuation is a good place to start with that. That's how I found my my coffee's home, because it has a map that it can actually help you pinpoint the location. And if you can't find it on your own, there's genealogy and heritage companies in Ireland that will help you find it. One of my most memorable moments in Ireland, it was in 2010, visiting my mom's great-grandfather Patrick Daly's family home in Kilbeggan, County Westmeath. The deserted dwelling is still standing and has several of the outbuildings. Patrick immigrated in 1875, but his brother remained in Ireland and raised 4 daughters in that not even a 2-bedroom. It was a 2-room cottage. The last of his 4 daughters lived there until 1973. So a neighbor actually remembered this daughter, Agnes, and kind of a funny story, but he said that, he remembered Agnes. When he was young, his parents would always say, "You better behave or I'm going to drop you off at Agnes Daly's." So that kind of put the fear into him. So not a great memory for this guy, but we enjoyed hearing the story. So that's the other thing, when you find these family homesteads, it might not be that long ago that your last relation lived in the home and neighbors may remember the person. I mean, I'm sure this guy has other great stories, too, that we could sit down and chat about. Another really neat thing I did on that same trip is I had the itinerary mapped out before we went, and I went through and found surname pubs and restaurants for all of our like Flannery's and Coffee's, Dailies. My cousin Lori Lynch was coming with us, so I found Lynch's, and I thought, how fun. And this was my second trip to Ireland, so I'm like, how fun to have our picture taken in front of all of these surname pubs and restaurants, and to get a T-shirt or souvenir from them. Yeah. Well, we quickly discovered that few of these establishments have surname souvenirs. However, at one of our first stops, it was a Flannery restaurant in County Mayo, which was just south of Castlebar, where my mom's Flannery's came from. The very lovely owner, she gave me a sweatshirt that was embroidered with a horse racing logo for Ballinrobe, County Mayo. Her brother raced horses there. And she refused to take money for it, so I gave her a nice tip. But that was our first picture was taken in front of that restaurant. We went to my cousin was Lori Lynch that was with us, and we went to a Lynch pub in Cork. My cousin offered the bartender a crazy amount of money for her logoed polo shirt, but the woman said, unfortunately, she only had one other shirt, so she couldn't do it as much as she would like to have taken the money. But she gave Lori several logoed lighters with the Lynch logo on it. So, and I was taking Lori's picture, and Lori's a tall, blonde woman, and I was taking her picture outside in front of the Lynch sign, and a patron was out there smoking, and he kind of sidled up to Lori and got into the picture, and he went inside, and then his buddy came out from inside with his beer and got his picture taken with Lori, and everybody kind of took turns. I have pictures of her with about 6 different pub patrons. So that was a very neat souvenir. We went home with several unique souvenirs. But the other thing about besides the souvenirs is that, the pubs are often owned by a person with that surname. So they're happy to sit and chat with you, even if it's not the same county that your ancestor was from, but to chat about the Lynch or the Coffee families. And, while you're there, buy a local a pint, just like the neighbors of your family homestead. You never know who you're going to meet in the pub and what information they might have. So I always very much encourage getting out and speaking to the locals. And I mean, they're very friendly and they love to chat. So you definitely could have some very good sources there in the locals.
Yeah, I really loved the examples that you gave in the article of the sort of genealogy serendipity. A conversation with this person led to this find, and you would never have thought it,
Oh,
and
right.
Certainly if you only stuck to sort of the tourist attraction-y parts of Ireland, you wouldn't see that. And so you're getting a sense for the local flavor and the people. I think that's so valuable and so enriching too.
I think too, another thing that helped me is my ancestors, a lot of them were from the Midlands. So County Meath and Westmeath, which of course don't have a lot of tourists. So when you're, at a restaurant or something, people are curious, why are you here? What are you doing? Are you lost? Dublin is this way, so they're very curious when they hear your accent and want to know exactly where you're from and why you're in the area. Yeah. And so I've been, not even surname pubs. I was in a pub one time and the woman asked us, my mom and I, why exactly we were in the area. And we told her about our coffee surname. And she's like, the Coffee sisters used to own the sweet shops across the street. Oh, too bad that, they're no longer around. They are deceased. But she's like, you need to be talking to Jimmy Coffee up the road. So then she's sending us to Jimmy Coffee's, who, I never would have found without her giving me direction. Unfortunately, Jimmy wasn't home, but I left a note on his door, which I've also left many notes on doors and gravestones and other places throughout Ireland to hopefully connect with somebody.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that you want to try to get that specific town, not just West Ireland or Dublin, where, it's a big area and you really want to kind of drill down to the townland level.
Yes.
To really home in on
if at all possible. Especially when you're dealing with common surnames, Murray, Kelly, any of those that are in the top 10. And I have to say, just a real quick note, my coffee is the 156th most common surname in Ireland. So not common at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know of any that were still in the area. But once I started actually researching in that area and talking to people, like I just said, they would direct me to a coffee that they knew. So, not being a common surname helped me, but there were still like 3 pockets of coffees. I think Roscommon, Westmeath, and Cork were the most commonplace. And case in point, I was told when I started doing the research, we didn't know who our immigrant ancestor was, but supposedly somebody knew the coffees came from County Cork.
Mm-hmm.
Well, about 300 miles from there in County Westmeath is where our coffees came from. So again, you have to take it, when you're looking at these placings somewhere in history, somebody probably said, well, there's a big, coffee population in Cork. That must be where they're from.
Yeah. And John Grenham's website has a place where you can research that, right? A surname heat map? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And no, I was on there not that long ago and I couldn't find it, but it's probably still on there and I just wasn't looking in the right place. But another really good thing is he has first names on there, not just surnames. Mm-hmm. And when I was researching who I think is my Scottish relative that ended up in the military in Galway, which is where he had his child. So again, a tip, don't just look within the country where you think your relation was born, because even though my Watson was raised in Scotland, I think he was born in Galway. So something, important to keep in mind. But Barbara is an uncommon name for a first name in Ireland. I mean, not common at all. And so I was like that. And I knew my ancestor's mother's name was Barbara. So that also got me to thinking, okay, this sounds more Scottish. Well, I put Barbara in to John Grenham's first name site to search. And like all the Barbaras were in Galway and Aran Islands in that area. Mm-hmm. And somebody told me somewhere along the way, and I'm trying to think exactly how this went, but that it was fishermen, that fishermen believed that for whatever reason, the name Barbara was a name to protect them on the waters. And when you lived, on the shores, I don't know exactly if that was true, but it is interesting that that area. Now, also, too, there was a big military garrison in that area. And so there were a lot of Scottish. So they could also have brought the name Barbara to that area, of Ireland. And then once it gets into the family naming pattern, it's a lot of, Scottish and English military men married Irish women.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sort of goes back to the idea of steppe migration, where before your ancestors came to the United States or to Australia, maybe they went to England first or they went to Scotland first, and trying to think holistically about what that journey might have been like. And
yeah, absolutely.
I think about that a lot with DNA too, because, people want to take a test and say, I'm, 15% Irish. Well, yeah, but there was a lot of kind of coming and going between different places. So it's not always so clear cut as people maybe want it to be sometimes.
Yeah, especially between Scotland and, Northern Ireland, that area. There was a lot of back and forth.
In your article, you talk a lot about researching not just your direct line ancestors, but also their siblings, their aunts and uncles, these collateral relatives, the clusters of people that they lived in, and two, researching their descendants to figure out who these people were, where they ended up, and this idea of reverse genealogy. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how it can help with Irish research?
Yes, absolutely. Reverse genealogy really helped me break down my coffee brick wall. I had several coffee brick walls, but it helped me break down one of them. So again, you may not be able to find information you need in your ancestors' records, but his siblings or their descendants might prove very helpful. When my ancestor, Patrick Coffey, he was here in the U.S., and when his wife died, there were 3 people that attended her funeral and were mentioned in her obituary that were from Davenport, Iowa, one being a man, Richard Coffey, and then 2 women who, of course, were named by their husbands' names, not even their first names. But I was able to trace them, the 3 of them, back to a census in Davenport and discovered their father was Michael Coffey. He was born in Ireland circa the time my Patrick was, or would have been. So I traced Michael's children forward and found descendants. When I contacted them, nobody had heard of my Patrick, but they knew that their ancestor Michael's birth location was a village in County Westmeath. I was able to find Michael's baptismal record, which was great because to this day, I still have not found Patrick's. Patrick quite likely, he was the firstborn, I believe, so he quite likely was born in his mother's townland because the women often went home, especially for the first child, to have their first child at their parents' home to have help and everything. But so again, I might still be beating my head against that brick wall if it wasn't for tracing Patrick's sibling forward and finding this information from his relations. So it's very important. And also another brick wall within my coffee line, I was able to break that down thanks to a daily relation who was completely unconnected from the coffees. But it was a matter of I found her and we visited the homestead, the Daly homestead together, in Kilbeggan. But her mother-in-law worked with a coffee gentleman who knew about a graveyard that I never would have found on my own and gave us a tour of it on my one visit there. And that proved instrumental in breaking down, that proved instrumental in solving the mystery, and I was able to connect my coffee line back to 1705.
Wow.
So again, it's so important networking, especially, because of the famine and so many families were separated that, the ones that remained in Ireland, may have a lot different and more information than what you have, being descended from the one who did immigrate. So again, finding them just in pictures, I have gotten many excellent photos of Irish relations, from these descendants of other siblings and whatnot in the family. So I just can't even emphasize enough how important reverse genealogy is when researching in Ireland.
Yeah, and we spent a lot of time talking about, start now and work backward in time, but that sort of working backward and forward kind of alternatively can really, really turn up some great finds, especially in places and times where it's hard.
Yeah, and it's amazing how many people do not do the reverse genealogy, and that's why I always like to emphasize it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Eliza, thank you so much for joining us today on the Family Tree Magazine podcast. You can find Eliza through her book, Genealogy Tips and Quips, and you can see her article, May the Road Rise to Meet You, in the March-April 2024 issue of Family Tree Magazine. Thank you so much, Eliza.
Okay, Andrew, thank you. This was incredible. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of the Family Tree Magazine podcast. This is the show from America's #1 genealogy magazine. You can find a web version of Eliza's article on overcoming Irish genealogy brick walls in this episode's show notes page, which you can find at familytreemagazine.com/genealogy-podcast. There, you'll also find a huge back catalog of past episodes full of topics that will help you in your genealogy research. When you stop by the website, be sure to sign up for our free newsletter. That's the perfect way to stay in touch with Family Tree Magazine and get all the latest and greatest genealogy news, plus the announcements of each and every new podcast episode. Until next time, have fun climbing your family tree.